Hello, Education 1306. This is John Luke Dempsey, and today I'm going to be presenting for my final project the emergence of the U.S. as a major world power in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. So to begin with the emergence of the U.S., we go to the Spanish-American War. Alright, so how this began was the USS Maine was docked in Cuba in 1898 to protect American interests and American business people who were in Cuba during the Cuban Revolution against Spain. Then the Maine mysteriously exploded. Back then they thought that it was the Spanish who shot, mainland US thought the Spanish shot the Maine. But today it is more likely that the munitions section of the ship exploded. The U.S. soon after attacked the Spanish colonies in the Caribbean Sea and Pacific Ocean, and the U.S. ended up winning the war, proving itself as a world power against a European nation. Not all Americans, though, supported the war, as in the political cartoon shown. Many thought this was just another land grab by the U.S. to expand its territory and reach in the world. Big influencers on the war during and American policy afterwards were Theodore Roosevelt, who was the Secretary of the Navy at the outset, but raised his own cavalry unit in the war and later became President of the United States. Sanford B. Dole, who before the war was an American businessman in Hawaii and led an American revolt against the Hawaiian Queen. The Hawaii eventually became a U.S. territory soon afterwards, and he became the governor of that territory. And Alfred Thayer Mahan is the proponent and creator of the sea power theory. He studied history of European nations and their massive navies they had in the past. And this led to him creating the theory that to have a strong economy, a nation needs an even more powerful navy that can reach all around the world. And he proposed this to U.S. many times in letters and documents and even presentations he gave while he was teaching at the Naval War College. During the war on the Pacific Front, the U.S. acquisition from Spain, Guam, which is a small island on the Mariana Island chain that the U.S. earned after defeating the Spanish there. When the U.S. arrived, the Spanish were actually quite surprised. They did not know that they were at war with the U.S., and when the officers announced this, they gave 30 minutes for Spanish officials to come up with their answer. Within the 30 minutes, the Spanish officials of Guam relinquished control of Guam and gave it over to the Americans. The Philippines, on the other hand, are an island chain 1,500 miles away from the Guam and Marianas, and the U.S. had to put up a little bit more of a fight here. They ended up destroying and surprising the Spanish fleet in Manila Bay and had to fight on the ground Spanish forces, but they secured the island by early August, or the island chain. And the Hawaiian Islands are the closest Pacific acquisitions, but they were not ruled by the Spanish. They were ruled by the Queen of Hawaii, who American businessmen overthrew earlier in the 1890s. The Caribbean acquisitions in the war were mainly Puerto Rico, one of Spain's only two Caribbean holdings. When U.S. forces invaded the island, they had secured it by mid-August with little to no resistance from Spanish forces. Cuba, after fighting off the Spanish in Cuba, the U.S. granted Cuban people somewhat autonomy, with the U.S. being its protectorate until the early 1950s, basically being a big brother and helping out Cuba. The American government wanted to think it owned Cuba, but the Cuban people refused to let that happen and made it known many times. Some major battles or events that happened here were San Juan Hill, which are well remembered because of the involvement of future U.S. President Teddy Roosevelt, and the destruction of the Spanish fleet as it was trying to escape Cuba, which ended up every Spanish ship in that fleet was either sunk or burned to a crisp. After the war, the U.S. standing in the world stage was increased by very much. When William McKinley was assassinated, a person who helped increase this standing was Theodore Roosevelt, who became president and helped us emerge as a world power. One of the first things Roosevelt helped create was a square deal, which was his economic plan to help the country out of a small recession it was in since 1893. A big part, the 3 C's as they're called, were conservation of natural resources and land, the control of corporations, making sure that they didn't get too big, and consumer protections, making sure that consumers knew what they were paying for and what they were getting. Some other accomplishments: Roosevelt oversaw the creation of the Panama Canal. He saw the need for a shorter route from the Pacific to the Atlantic. And when the French left a failed project half finished in Panama, U.S. decided to buy up the land and start another project there, and succeeded, creating the modern day Panama Canal. Another thing Roosevelt helped do was mediate Russia and Japan after they fought a short war, and he won the Nobel Peace Prize for doing so. This war is also called the Russo-Japanese War, in which the Japanese surprisingly beat back Russian soldiers. So for the project assessment, the students, as they saw, would have learned about political cartoons and how they were a big deal for both sides, and every side being horrendous in their depictions of each other. And very interesting too. The political cartoons were a way that the average day newspaper would try and get across big ideas to the average American. So a student will examine and research a few more political cartoons with 2 or 3 other partners, and then they will come up with a meme, which we can easily view as today's modern day cartoons or political cartoons. And so students will make a meme based around an event that happened during this era. And then for my backup plan, if I were not able to present this in the classroom because of technology failure, I would have a print out copies, only a few, ready to go, sitting on my teacher desk. And I would hand out a few to the class, and I would teach just as if nothing had gone wrong. And then the standards that you could easily see in this project. For me, as a learner, as a teacher, I learned more about Google Slides and doing some neat little tricks with it. For the leader ISTE, I would try to approach this topic in a way to get the students interested and allow them to be able to talk and give ideas instead of me just being the one talking and talking and talking. When the students are working on the meme, they will give credit as they should according to APA or MLA guidelines, and it must also be school appropriate. For the Collaborate STE, students will work in groups of 2 to 3 to come up with a meme and explain how it relates to the subject matter. This would help a student who might be artistic but does not know history or does not understand it as well compared to a student who understands history but may not be very artistic. They could collaborate together, work together to come up with an easy A project that would help benefit both of them. For designer, I adhere to the guidelines for making an interesting slide presentation that would keep audiences engaged. For the facilitator, again, I would just try and keep the discussion open to dialogue and input. And when students were giving presentation, I would allow even more questions and I would hope that the students would be able to explain how their modern day meme relates to the subject material that they are trying to present. And then to analyze the students and their understanding of the material, the assessment would be 50% of it would be this project, and the other 50 would be a quiz that I would give them. And that is my final project.